Hello and welcome back to the Conflict Skills Podcast. I'm your host, professional mediator Simon Good. In this podcast, I provide free resources and tools for dealing with conflict, whether that's connected to workplace or personal relationships. So if that's the kind of thing that sounds like it would be useful for you, please consider pressing subscribe. In the episode today, I'm going to be talking about an interesting topic, at least for me, why conflict is so stressful. A lot of people come to conflict resolution training workshops that I run, and they're often experiencing a high level of stress. It's a very tumultuous and turbulent place to be when you're in the middle of conflict. And people tend to think about work-life balance, which implies some type of a separation between our work relationships and personal life and vice versa. But of course, when we're experiencing conflict, whether it's in our personal relationships, especially if it's someone that's important to you, like your partner, one of your kids, a parent, a different family member, or a close friend, or even at work, of course that is something that we find so impacts us at a deep level because we spend so much time at work and there's a lot at stake. It's connected to our being able to support ourselves and financial well-being and all of the rest of it, let alone all of the, physiological impacts that go along with conflict in both of those spheres that we carry back and forth. If we're fighting with our partner at home, then we get stressed out and worked up, and then maybe we don't sleep. We toss and turn and wake up not feeling very well rested. We show up to work and we're more irritable than we normally would be, and we're snappy with our colleagues, and so they might find a way to react to us at some stage through the day, and then we're not aware of the fact that we've been acting in this particular way, so we interpret their behavior as unreasonable, and then the negative spiral builds and builds and builds. And so if we can become aware of why conflict causes us so much stress, it opens the door for self-care. If we can become clear around the kinds of factors that cause us to escalate, the things that are pushing our buttons, then it means that we can develop a plan for self-regulation. And so if you would like to feel more composed and calm and, in control during conflict, or to have conflict affect you less moving forward, then stay tuned. The way that our brain works is that it's effectively a signal processor. We have access to too much information to take in at any one time. If I ask you a question like, what's your tongue doing in your mouth at the moment? You can feel it. You can feel your tongue in your mouth. But 5 seconds ago, before I asked you that question, you weren't paying attention to the feeling of your tongue in your mouth. And so that's true from everything in our visual perception, touch, smell, hearing. Our brain is incredibly efficient at focusing our perception on the areas of our perception that it deems as important. And so what our brain considers to be important and what our perception mechanism sort of regards as important and focuses on, so to speak, depends on our aim. And all of this is built within a hardware system, our brain and our body, that has evolved through a process of thousands and thousands of years of evolution, where a lot of the threats that we've experienced have been physical. And so we've developed this way of dealing with threats, the fight or flight response that you might have heard people use, that phrase. It's a good way of dealing with physical threats. If a bear's going to attack you, then fight or flight are two pretty good options for dealing with a bear. The challenge is that our brain and our body escalate in a very similar way. We go into a similar fight or flight mode for non-physical threats, and that includes things like conflict. And so we need to understand why our brain is interpreting this conflict as stressful, as threatening, so to speak, because then it introduces the ways that we can manage it. So when I talk about threat, there's been a bear that's going to eat us. That's one type of threat that we've faced historically. But what kind of other situations would your ancestors, cave-dwelling humans, have found dangerous? Well, conflict within a tribe would be one thing. If you've got family members or tribe members that you work with and you rely on for your survival, like you're sharing food, you're hunting together, you're probably mating together and looking after each other's kids, and I imagine it would have been quite a close-knit relationship with the people around you. And so when there was conflict going on, this would be a pretty dramatic threat to your survival. So it makes sense why our brain is particularly prone to looking at conflict, broadly speaking, as threatening. It's because historically that would have been very much connected to our likelihood of death or our likelihood of reproducing, or our likelihood of access to resources like food, etc. If there's conflict going on, then people aren't going to share with you. There are also other factors, though, that we tend to interpret as a threat, and a lot of those are also connected to conflict. Something like uncertainty, for example, when we don't know what is going to happen next. We can't predict the short term or the medium term or the long term, but particularly the short term. When all of a sudden something changes that we weren't expecting and we have this shocked kind of reaction, that's something that historically has been pretty dangerous for us. That has been a threatening thing that happens. We go looking for food and it's not there, or we thought this animal was a herbivore and so we walk up to hunt it and all of a sudden it turns around and we see a row of teeth that we weren't expecting. So uncertainty hasn't typically been a very good recipe for survival, and so it makes sense why our brain interprets that as such a threatening situation to be in. Connected to that as well is another factor, loss of control. When we're in a situation and we're not in the driver's seat, so to speak, then of course that's a situation where we're not as likely to survive. We're not as likely to be able to do what we need to do to look after ourselves. It's like being on the roller coaster and coming up over the scariest bit of the track, and all of a sudden, here you go, it's about to speed up and that really terrifying bit's about to happen. Part of the reason why that's so scary is that you're not in control of it, I suppose, in a sense. It might also be the fact that you're reassured by your underlying assumption that the mechanics knew what they were doing and all that kind of thing. But loss of control is something that most people tend to find threatening, and particularly when it was unexpected and you might have had a level of control previously. So your partner all of a sudden saying to you, actually, I don't want to do this thing that we've agreed to, or your boss telling you that there'll be some changes coming up within the organization and they haven't decided what they'll be yet. That all of a sudden loss of control, it's like we don't know where we're standing anymore. We've lost that solid footing that we were on. And so, of course, this is a situation where our brain and our body interpret as a threat. And so as a result, we feel like we need to do something about it. Difficult emotions often come along with conflict too, and we tend to want to avoid those. Things like guilt or being criticized for something that we've done inherently are factors that we want to avoid. It's like our ego wants to maintain a self-perception that we're important and we're a legend and we're awesome and all the rest of it. And so all of a sudden in conflict, when we're, most of us, choosing our words a little bit bluntly and probably losing it and looking a bit more red-faced, and our voice gets a bit more high and shrieky and embarrassing than we might normally do. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing looking back on the way that we deal with ourselves in conflict for most of us anyway, unless you're the kind of person that doesn't mind what other people think of you at an extreme level. But the guilt, it's the shame, and particularly worrying about other people's perception of you, like loss of status. We shouldn't underestimate those factors in conflict as well. Loss of status, lowering of your own ego, lowering of reputation. All of those things are factors that we very much want to avoid in the day-to-day operation in our work life or in our personal life. And so, of course, as conflict comes along and brings this whole host of other baggage with it, our brain and our body are like, no, thank you. I want to avoid this situation, please. This is a threat. What are our options for dealing with threats? Fight or flight. And so that's what happens. So we can understand that. Our brain is in a role of ensuring our survival, and part of that is scanning for threats, and when conflict comes along, we interpret it as a threat. This does mean then, I suppose, that in a sense, conflict is all in our head. And if we think about relationships, that's certainly true. There's no tangible metrics that we can use for a relationship, for something like closeness or intimacy or trust. They're all subjective perceptions, I guess, values that we might have, but to be honest, I don't think you even have a very tangible, clear metric about what trust is in a relationship. We often recognize changes in trust, like when trust has been abused, it might be much lower than it used to be, but it's not like you can actually say it's a 3 out of 10 or a 4 out of 10 or something like that. So if we understand that conflict and the relationship itself is all in our head, it means that we have a lot of potential power to influence it and manage it. And so when conflict is stressful, the first thing that we can ask ourselves is what happens? What's the pattern of that impact? And for me, when I'm doing conflict resolution training, I often find it helpful to talk about the 5 different aspects of you, sort of drawn from a principle in Buddhism. Where the Buddha sort of described what are you, what's the part of self. It's like we talk about self-care, but we might not actually have a definition in our head of what self is. There's obviously our physical self, our physical body, our cells and atoms and, the bits that we can touch and feel. And when conflict happens and we interpret it as threatening and it causes us stress, there'll be physiological changes. Our body is affected. It's an increase in adrenaline, blood pressure, blood sugar levels, all that kind of stuff. But even just tiredness or soreness or feeling strained and stretched and maybe shaking and feeling like you're particularly vulnerable to negative perceptions, like you're picking up on just how uncomfortable the fabric is in your clothes that you're wearing, whereas on other days you might not pay attention to that if the sun's shining and you're more of a happy disposition. Conflict also affects our emotions. We experience waves of strong emotions like anger and frustration, or helplessness, or grief, or sadness, or it might be just wishing that things were different and this is not fair, it's not right, and we become almost obsessed, ruminating with these patterns of thought, wishing that things were different, even if effectively it's not something that we can do anything about. Our thinking patterns are affected. We become more prone to negative thinking, for example. We assume the worst in other people's intentions. We feel like maybe somebody's out to get us or they're wanting revenge. Whereas probably in their own motivation and their own perception, we don't actually factor in to their story as much as we think that we do. But in our story, in our head, we're the main player. So of course, our thinking patterns then tend to catastrophize when things aren't right or something goes wrong. Conflict affects our perception as well, which is the 4th area. We tend to get tunnel vision. We tend to become less aware of the impact of our behavior, for example, or how we've contributed to situations that we find ourselves in. And then the final layer is our actions, our behavior. Conflict can create this snowball of problems with impulsivity, for example. We might turn to negative coping mechanisms like drinking or drugs or online shopping or pornography or gambling or anything to give us that short-term dopamine release to help ourselves feel better. And this is just a self-protection mechanism. Our brain is recognizing that this isn't an ideal state to be. This is a threat, and so we need to do something about it. We want to feel better. And so if we can realize that conflict is causing us stress because of this connection to threat, and that it's impacting us in these 5 layers, our physical body, our physical self, our emotions, our thought patterns, our cognition, 4th would be our perception, and then 5th would be our actions, then it means if we want to look after ourselves and do something about it, reduce that level of stress, then we've got those 5 different buckets that we can use to develop options. If my conflict affects me physically, then maybe I really need to get a good night's sleep tonight, so I'm not going to be watching an interesting show that's going to get my brain spinning and I'll have trouble switching it off. Or I'll make sure I eat particular foods or I avoid alcohol or something like that. Or I'll make sure that I really have a healthy meal as soon as I get home, because I know that I leave it too long, I'll be prone to order delivery and it's going to be something that's less healthy. Or I can think about my emotional patterns, realize when I'm feeling low, and then maybe even recognize that connection to my perception. And don't trust my thoughts and my perception and my emotion when I'm at those low points. I can recognize it. I can, realize that I'm feeling tumultuous and not good and negative, and I'm having trouble relaxing and sitting still. And my thoughts keep going back to this jerk at work that I'm dealing with at the moment. Like, I can recognize that this is happening, but I need to make a decision about how much I keep feeding it. Which brings us to the last option, really, which is the healthy self-care, the healthy self-protection. It's thinking through, what do you need at the moment? Is it being by yourself and just a bit of peace and quiet? Maybe you need to connect with people that give you a little bit of a positive spark and joy. Send a message to someone that you haven't talked to for a little while and just say, hey, traveling, just thinking of you. I was just remembering this funny thing that happened to us many years ago. And that little injection of positivity It's a healthy source of that dopamine. We feel that connection. It's something that's actually good for us. Then it might be all that's needed for that slight shift in direction in those other layers, your emotions, your thoughts, your perception, which means that 30 minutes later, you're not feeling quite as negative as you were. You were at a 1 out of 10, in terms of how happy you were in that moment. Now you're at a 1.5 or a 2. But that might mean that you can engage a different thinking pattern then, and maybe make a to-do list of a few things that you want to do for the rest of the evening. Or manage some of the emotions, like write a song or just draft a message to someone that you'd been thinking of, or write a to-do list, or press record and record an audio recording of you just venting. Or think about just a healthy release of the emotion, like going and hitting a punching bag or running on a treadmill or something like that. As we understand the reason that conflict is causing us so much stress, and we've got this build-up of this fight or flight response with all of the associated kinetic energy and adrenaline and cortisol, then the kinds of things that are going to be helpful for us are the factors that are either a release of that build-up of energy, or the kinds of things that give our brain and our body cues that this is a situation that's under control, that we can get through this, that I don't need to be flapped and flustered and overwhelmed and all the rest of it. I can understand why my brain is engaged in that pattern right now. If I saw a threatening thing that day, then I'd be glad that my brain is reminding me of it. If there's this dangerous thing happening outside in my neighborhood and I'm going for a walk, then I want my brain to be a little bit vigilant. The problem is that because conflict is something that we also interpret as threat, our brain gets a little bit hypervigilant. It pays a little bit too much attention to those things, especially when they're not needed. Like when it's 2 a.m. and we're trying to get back to sleep and we can't stop thinking about this jerk from the accounts team that sent us this rude email last week, or whatever the thing is that you're sitting there getting distracted by and probably engaged in a pretty unhelpful pattern of rumination. And what happens there is that there's a flow-on effect in those other negative areas. Like when we are in that negative thought pattern, then it affects our body. There's a physical change. It affects our emotions. There's negative stuff that comes along. It affects our perception. And then it affects our action, our volition, our self-control. So I hope that has been helpful for you, unpacking some of those factors that contribute to why conflict is so stressful for us, as well as the different options that we have for responding. If you've got feedback about the podcast, you can shoot me an email. It's podcast@simongood.com. Or if you'd like to check out my training workshops and other services, you can check out my website. It's simongoode.com. I always find it very hard recording these outros after I've just done a podcast episode. I should probably learn my lesson and press pause. Anyway, I've just gone ahead and recorded it today. Thank you very much for listening. If it's been helpful, please consider pressing subscribe and leaving a positive review. It's the best thing that you can do, because it's a little cue to the algorithm that other people might find the podcast helpful as well. All the best. Bye for now.